It's the Immigrant Experience with Nenelwa podcast, episode 002. Let's do it.
And welcome to the Immigrant Experience with Nenelwa. I am Nenelwa Tomi, and I am your host for this show, The Immigrant Experience with Nenelwa. I'm a Tanzanian American, and as I continue to reflect on my personal journey and transition into the American system, I often think about religion as it played quite an instrumental part in my immigrant experience. Despite the fact that I owned my heritage and was proud to tout it whenever it proved convenient, I didn't know much about where I came from. I didn't know that the reason we had so many relatives who identified as Muslim was not only because Tanzania is predominantly Muslim, but also because of our complicated history with Arab colonizers. With that said, my personal relationship to religion is equally as complicated. I have fasted for Ramadan in solidarity with my extended cousins, aunts, and uncles, have opened the Sabbath on Friday evenings with relatives who are like siblings to me, and have wrestled with my own notions of what it truly means to be Christ-like. Because of this early exposure, I've learned to be more open and loving to others outside of religious affiliations. And I'm so grateful for these unintentional teachable moments because they have made me who I am today. The Immigrant Experience with Nenelwa is a weekly podcast about the African immigrants' experience in the United States. We'll be hearing great stories from immigrants of different nationalities, genders, marital statuses, professions, and experiences. Stories of strength, stories that inspire, stories that show us what obstacles to avoid and how our guests have avoided or overcome them. These are ordinary men and women with extraordinary stories. Let's begin. Our guest on the show today is Andrena Sawyer. She is from Sierra Leone and has lived in the U.S. for 20 years in June. Andrena is currently working as an entrepreneur and has started her own business called Perk Consulting and lives in Maryland. Like many African immigrants, Andrena came to the U.S. to find greener pastures, but discovered that the road wasn't as easy as advertised. Andrena, welcome to the Immigrant Experience with Nenelwa.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to be on.
It is our pleasure to host you. So Andrena, we want to start off kind of getting a snapshot of your upbringing and your background. So can you talk to us about where home is for you?
Sure. You know, that question is a little complicated because in my heart, home will always be Freetown, Sierra Leone. Mm-hmm. That's where I was born. That's where I lived until I was about 9 years old.
Wow.
When I was 9, my family left Sierra Leone because of the Civil War. And we moved to New Jersey, and I lived in New Jersey until I was 18 and left for college.
Wow.
And so that was, I'm aging myself a little bit, but that was a little over 10 years ago.
Okay.
And so I've lived in the Washington, D.C. area for most of that time. So home is Sierra Leone, but a part of home is also New Jersey, and a part of home is also the D.C. area.
Definitely. So how have both of those homes shaped your worldview? So you talk a bit about Sierra Leone as one aspect of home in that identity phase, and then you talk about the DC metro area. So how have they shaped your worldview currently?
Well, that's an interesting question as well. I think being from Sierra Leone has shaped so much of my life and my worldview, the way I appreciate different opportunities that I've gotten as a result of coming from a country that's impoverished, that's developing, but is very rich. Rich culturally, rich socially. It's enabled me to be a more compassionate and well-rounded person. But also being in the D.C. area is fueled that passion to do something about my desires and my ambitions. So Sierra Leone kind of set the stage for me, and DC is what motivated me to actually do something about where I come from and some of the things I want to do to help my people.
Excellent. So what brought you to the United States?
Well, as I mentioned, Sierra Leone went through a decade-long civil war. The war started in about 91, and it actually started outside of Sierra Leone, but by 1995, which is when my family and I left, it had moved into the capital, Freetown, where I'm from. And so my parents made the decision at that time to move us to the United States.
Wow, that must have been a difficult transition or challenging to even think about, kind of leaving this place that was so centered to who you are.
Oh, absolutely.
So
I'd never known anything outside of Sierra Leone. My friends, our family, everything was in Sierra Leone. And I think I was so young and I didn't really understand the depth of what was going on. And so I took for granted that I would always just return home and continue with life as I knew it. But, you know, I soon found out that that would not be the case. And so that completely altered so much for me.
And when did you have that epiphany? When did you find that out?
Well, I found out within a year that we were not going back. But I don't think it hit me until my early teens.
Wow.
So 13, 14 years old was when I realized, you know, my life has changed.
Definitely. So do you remember your first impressions of the U.S. when you got here? What it was like? Was it everything that you had thought it was going to be in the movies and the magazines? Or maybe you had no idea at all what to expect?
You know, my first American movie that I saw was Mrs. Doubtfire. And so my idea about America was based on Mrs. Doubtfire.
Wow.
So when we came to America, I was expecting to see only Caucasian, big buildings, you know, cities that look like San Francisco, which is where I think that movie's based. And that was not the case. And people were nasty to me. Kids were nasty to me in school. And so I was completely turned off.
Wow.
I wanted to go back home.
Right. And so how has that impression of the U.S. changed over time? Because clearly it's not a Mrs. Doubtfire film. It's definitely a little bit more intricate than that. So how has that shifted over time?
Well, I think, you know, naturally I've matured. So I'm able to put things in a perspective and their proper context. And so I've encountered people who were ignorant and who were mean, but I've also encountered people who were very open-minded and who taught me a lot. And so I think my view about people and cultivating relationships has definitely broadened. But I also recognize America is a place with so many different opportunities, and it's up to you to figure out how you want to utilize them.
For sure. So now we're going to transition a bit into some of the challenges of assimilating and transitioning into the United States or any new country or community. So how difficult was it for you to assimilate into American culture? You talked a bit about high school or your early teen years being kind of difficult in terms of just some of the feedback you were getting from your peers. I'm sure there were some cultural things that were difficult as well. So can you kind of share with us a little bit about that aspect of your story?
Sure. Initially, I think the hardest part for me was making friends. So I'm naturally an extrovert. I'm a people person. I love being around people. And I can't think of a better word to describe my initial experience than I was shunned. I remember classmates making comments about how I smelled and how my hair was done. And they would complain to the teacher. Some students didn't even want to sit next to me.
Oh.
And so dealing with that and feeling that rejection was very hurtful. And I remember my grades started to suffer in junior high because of that.
Wow.
And I tried so hard to assimilate and to get people to like me. And so I started rejecting some of what were our core values. So education, the value of education, the value of a good work ethic. For a moment, I turned my back on those things because I was so desperate for people to like me.
Wow.
And so that process was, looking back at it, was a hurtful process. But I also remember another part of assimilating was understanding my family's economic position. Because in Sierra Leone, my father did well. My mom did well. She worked at an airline. So these were just average middle-class workers. But coming here, my mother couldn't find a job. My father was working 3 jobs, and one of them being a waiter at a hotel. And so understanding that we could not do the things that we used to as a family was also something that required some processing on my part.
I can imagine, because that's definitely a different transition. And how do you think that impacted your parents as well? Because they were coming in kind of looking for that American dream, knowing that they've also had prior experiences that make them qualified to do certain things, and then kind of getting that shock of, well, no, this is what you're limited to. These are your options. So how did that affect them, you think, as well?
Well, now I definitely see where it may have caused a culture shock, maybe some depression, a lot of anxiety for sure. I'm grateful to my parents, though, and I've noticed this with a lot of immigrant parents. They do a really good job of hiding the reality of their new circumstances. And so my sisters and I, at that time, we knew things had changed, but we didn't know the extent to which they changed. And because our parents did a very good job of giving us what we needed and not necessarily everything that we wanted. But I know looking back at it, my father was constantly stressed. And, you know, who wouldn't be if you're working 3 jobs in a week?
Right. Well, you talk about a lot of challenges, but clearly you've overcome them. So can you talk a bit about how you went about overcoming those challenges?
Sure. Well, there are two main things. I think for me, embarking on this process of being confident in my identity and just self-evaluation in high school was really helpful. Once I realized that being an immigrant was actually a really good thing and not a cross to bear, all of a sudden my perspective and my worldview started to change. And the other thing that really helped was having a community of people who really affirmed my experience and affirmed my potential and affirmed my ambition and pushed me to use those values to do something good.
Right. That's excellent. So we know that oftentimes in the African community, families and tradition play a huge role in the decisions that we make. Sometimes, though, our family members don't completely understand what we're going through while we're trying to integrate into these new environments. So can you talk a bit about what role, if any, your family played in helping or hindering you as you work to establish yourself in the U.S.?
Sure. Well, I definitely agree that sometimes they don't understand. I remember coming home sometimes and trying to explain to my mother this bicultural experience, and she didn't understand it because she didn't understand simple concepts like having to turn off your accent when you're in a certain environment. Because for her, you know, growing up in Sierra Leone, that wasn't an option.
Right.
And, you know, so there are certain nuances of the experience that she didn't get. But I was very fortunate that my parents' worldview was shaped more by their religious affiliation than their cultural experiences and affiliations. And so everything was always pointed back to, well, how do we handle this as a Christian, you know, for example, and not necessarily just as a Sierra Leonean or African.
Right.
And so that was always
the constant,
the deciding factor.
Definitely. Can you talk about a time, if any, that your stay in the United States was threatened? And that can be taken kind of in a number of different ways, but however you perceive it. And if so, what was the threat and how did you overcome that? Because I think that's something that a lot of our audience members currently deal with is, you know, things are pretty smooth until something seems to get in the way. There's an obstacle placed in front of them that really taints whatever progress is being made. And so that can really take someone 3 steps back or 3 steps forward. So how do we overcome those moments?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is my family and I came to here with an asylee status.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, similar to a refugee status. And so every year we'd have to go to renew our status so that we wouldn't get deported.
Right.
So there was always this lingering fact of what happens if we're sent back to Sierra Leone. What happens to our education? What happens to our physical safety, considering that our country, was in war at that time?
Mm-hmm.
And so having to deal with that, again, faith was a huge clutch or anchor for us. But my thinking ahead, so my parents were planners. So if there came a time where we did have to go back, what would be our other options? So where else can we go?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of our extended family members ended up leaving Sierra Leone and going to other African countries like the Gambia.
Wow.
And so we started considering, is that an option for us?
Mm-hmm.
As far as other threats to our stay here, there's always a threat of not advancing, so stagnancy. So many opportunities were taken away or not even given to us in the first place because of barriers like language and, culture and things like that. So you deal with them and you continue to advance as best as you can.
And it sounds like you have. So knowing what you know now, what advice would you give to the younger you that immigrated here 20 years ago?
Wow, I've thought about that question so many times.
Perfect. Now you get to answer it publicly.
Yeah. I mean, there are a few things that I would say to her. The one thing that I would start with is to be okay with who you are. Being Sierra Leonean is such a beautiful thing. I recently, a friend of mine asked me, how come I don't have an accent anymore? And I was sharing with him, I worked really hard when I got here to lose my accent.
Really?
My parents at home, they would speak Creole to us, and I refused to speak it back. I always spoke English because I wanted to lose the accent. And I regret that.
Wow.
Because I don't like explaining to people that I'm Sierra Leonean. That's how proud I am of it. I want you to know because it shapes so much of who I am. I want people to know, know that I'm African. So I would tell her, be proud of who you are. Be proud of the experiences. Never be ashamed even of the challenges because they've shaped you and they've made you stronger.
Definitely. So apart from some of the resources you've mentioned that could be really beneficial for someone transitioning into the U.S., especially this advice that you've recently given us, what other resources do you know of that could be useful for immigrants as they're transitioning into the U.S.?
Well, so at the school level, there are so many different programs that I didn't take advantage of, even when I was a young student. So, having the ESOL department. But locally, there are several different organizations that I would recommend. I work with the Department of Human Services, and so anyone that needs special services can go into the Department of Human Services and they can be referred to Lutheran Social Services or EWINT.
Okay.
But there are different social service organizations. If you're a professional, Nene, you're a part of Young African Professionals, and that's a network for those of us who are dealing with that bicultural experience. And I've met great people, through that network as well.
Definitely. Well, that's excellent. Thank you for sharing that. That's going to be really helpful for our audience members. So we'd love to get to know more about you and the current work that you're doing. So are you working on any project right now or even within your current employment status that you'd like to share with us and that you'd like the audience to know a bit more about?
Sure. Well, I'm not working on any new projects per se. But, I work for Perk Consulting.
You are Perk
all
Consulting?
My energies and all my focus
Right.
is constantly devoted to building that company.
Mm-hmm.
And what we do is we help nonprofits and small businesses with strategic planning services.
Okay.
So, and we actually just opened an office in Beltsville.
Excellent.
Maryland.
Congratulations.
So I'm constantly working to build that.
That's awesome. And so how can our audience reach you to get more information about PERC Consulting?
Sure. I am on social media. I'm on Twitter at PERC_consulting, or just at my name, Andrena_Sawyer. And then there's our website, PERCconsulting.net.
Excellent. Multiple different ways to get in contact with Andrena and to get involved with PERC Consulting. Well, Andrena, thank you so much for coming on my show. This has really been a fantastic discussion. And you've left us with a lot to think about, especially around just faith being a huge anchor for our experiences, regardless of the cultural barriers that are sometimes in place, and to really be okay with who we are. So we appreciate that message, and that is going to continue to resonate with us. So thank you for sharing your experiences with us, and we wish you the very best of luck as you continue onwards and forward.
Thank you so much, and it's my pleasure.
It was our pleasure.
And I'm excited about the show.
We are too.
What an inspiring story from our guest today. Hello, my name is Adetoye Oremosu, and I'm the author of the book, The Immigrant's Guide to Settling in America. To provide even greater value with this podcast, I'm offering a 40% discount to all listeners of The Immigrant Experience with Nenelwa. To take advantage of this offer, go to the Immigrant Experience with Nenelwa page on Facebook to like our page, and also get your discount code there while the offer lasts. I've learned a lot in my time in the US, and I've also suffered a lot, sometimes unnecessarily, because I did not have the right information in time. I don't want you to go through the same experiences. There are many opportunities that immigrants don't know exist, so they don't even know to ask for them. My book shows you many of these opportunities in areas of finding work, housing and accommodation, feeding, and understanding the US credit system.
It has been really great having Andrena Sawyer on the show. If there's a guest you'd like us to interview or any questions you want asked on subsequent shows, or you just want to say hello and leave an encouraging word, please post them on the Immigrant Experience with Nenelwa page on Facebook. That's our show for today. Special thanks to the creator and producer of this show, Adetoye Oremosu. The Immigrant Experience with Nenelwa is a weekly podcast, and I look forward to bringing you a brand new story with an inspiring and exciting guest next week. Until then, keep winning.